Well, my friends, things have been getting pretty bad in Cuba, but now they seem to have the potential to get significantly worse. 2026 is proving to be an interesting year, and it's only just begun. Yes, one of the top questions that we've received here on this channel in the past several weeks is whether or not Cuba's communist government is finally going to fall in 2026 after decades of issues that have all but paralyzed the state. Because let's face it, the country is really struggling. There are regular blackouts due to the lack of oil, this being a problem that is only exacerbated by the fall of Maduro and the US policy of halting new oil shipments. And after the events in Venezuela and the massive protests in Iran, there is a general sense that we are potentially in a year of revolutionary change across the world. And it, again, literally is just the first month of 2026. So why not Cuba? Well, we will see. At the time that I'm preparing this video, though, of course, that could be horribly out of date soon, as often happens with me, considering how long it takes for me to make one of these things here in the first place. As many of you called me out here on my previous Iran video, the Trump administration is weighing new tactics to drive regime change within Cuba, including imposing a total blockade on oil imports, according to some anonymous sources. That escalation has been sought by some critics of the Cuban government in the administration and is heavily backed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Of course, with me saying that, no decision has, at the time that I am making this video on, January 27th, 2026, no decision has been made as to whether or not to approve that move, but it could be among the various possible actions that are presented to President Donald Trump to force the end of Cuba's communist government. Which, I have to say, preventing shipments of crude oil at all to the island would definitely be a step up from Trump's mid-January 2026 statement that the US would halt Cuba's import of oil from just Venezuela, which had been its main crude supplier. But at the same time that I say that, there are apparently debates within the administration about whether it is even necessary to go that far, as the loss of Venezuelan oil shipments and the resale of some of those cargoes that Havana would use to obtain foreign currency have already throttled Cuba's laggard economy, which has been floundering for years at this point. A total blockade of oil imports into Cuba could then spark an even worse humanitarian crisis than what has already been going on, which is a possibility that has led some in the administration to push back against it. Just a week ago, on Friday, January 23rd, the Cuban electrical system would collapse once again, in what is now a common occurrence, with blackouts lasting 24 hours, and a deficit reaching extreme levels daily. According to the official statement from the Union Electrica, the UNE, the maximum impact due to a lack of generation capacity on this particular occasion was 1,905 megawatts at 6:30 p.m. At 6 a.m. on Saturday the 24th, the actual availability of the National Electric System, the SEN, was only 1,170 megawatts compared to a demand of 2,280 megawatts, which means you have a regular deficit of 1,120 megawatts. That this was the impact since the early hours of the day when demand wasn't even all that high. The system just literally can't provide anything. Cuba, quite literally, does not have the energy to keep itself functioning in any meaningful way, creating fears of further crisis and collapse. But, with me saying that, how likely is this to take place? Why is the Cuban economy so bad in the first place, and is the US really to blame for what has and will happen, as a number of people on the internet like to say? Well, my friends, in order to be able to go and understand the current situation in Cuba, as always here on the History of Everything, we do have to go and dive into the past and context. This is, after all, one of the oldest adversaries, if you will, that the United States has had, and as such, the relationship has been strained, to put it mildly, for quite some time. But it really is only in the past couple of decades that things within Cuba have become as bad as they are. Because of this, since I have gone over it before in an older video, we will need to really speed run through the older past so you can understand. But we have not talked about Cuba in a while, and there is a lot to understand here to really know why things are so incredibly bad. So, with that being said, to begin, the history of modern Cuba began with the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492 and the subsequent invasion of the island by the Spaniards. Don't look at me that way. But my friends, before does it go any further, I would like to thank today's sponsor, Epic Armory, who has seen fit to quite literally equip me with an armory's worth of stuff.
Literally what you see right here is just a small taste of it, because this store, this online store, is absolutely amazing. And I use all their stuff for my varying different LARP events that I do, which, by the way, if you want to meet me and fight me in some of these, check out the description. But we're talking axes, we're talking swords, we're talking shields, we are talking spears. They have so many things, from gambesons to chainmail to plate mail. Literally anything that you can think of that you would possibly want to use to fight someone, you can. And again, on that note, if you actually want to fight me, you totally can do that. I am outright down to do this. I have seen the way that you all talk in the comment section sometimes. But if you are going to do that, you are going to need to actually be prepared, which means you should definitely check out Epic Armory, because I gotta say, among all sponsors of things I've ever actually gotten stuff for, I'm not even getting paid for this. They literally just sent me a buttload of equipment, and I will literally use it to give it to you to fight me. But again, check out the links down in my description. Thank you so much, Epic Armory, for sponsoring me and giving me so much crap. I absolutely love this stuff. And now, back to the show.
I have to talk about it, my friends. It's me. What do you expect? Yes, we're going to be going back to the beginning, but we have to speed run through this so you understand exactly why the island is the way it is today. And it really does go back by 500 years. Prior to the arrival of the Spanish, native peoples did inhabit the island, but they were soon largely eliminated or died as a result of disease or the shock of conquest. Which means that over the course of much of Cuban history, the impact of indigenous groups on the subsequent Cuban society was rather limited. And Spanish culture, institutions, language, and religion would all prevail quite easily, which did help to keep it loyal when all the other Latin American colonies were breaking free in the 19th century. See, we skipped by like 300 years just to establish that real quick. Either way, for centuries after its conquest, Cuba was largely more of a neglected agricultural hub, while some of the more valuable mineral-rich territories of Latin and South America were focused on by the Spanish. If you then go and fast forward, because, again, we really do need to get through this fast, Cuba would awaken dramatically in the 19th century. The growth of the United States as an independent nation, the collapse of Haiti as a sugar-producing colony, as we've talked about here before, Spanish protective policies, and more would all converge to produce a sugar revolution on the island. In just the span of like a few years, Cuba was transformed from this sleepy, unimportant island into the major sugar producer in the world. It was a rapid change. Slaves would arrive in increasing numbers, large estates would squeeze out smaller ones, sugar would replace tobacco, agriculture, and cattle as the main occupation of the island. Prosperity would replace poverty, though of course this was not evenly distributed, and Spain's attention would replace neglect. When you consider all of these factors, especially the latter two, this would delay a move towards independence in the early 19th century, as while most of Latin America was breaking with Spain, Cuba would, over the course of the 1800s, at least initially, remain loyal. When I talk about this here, my friends, remember this part right now. Sugar was quite literally everything for Cuba. It made the island what it was, and that is a detail that we will harken back to time and time again, because going into the 20th century, things were going to change rapidly, but we're not quite there yet. Continue to fast forward, and towards the end of the 19th century, Cuban loyalty would begin to change. A 10-year war against Spain would break out from 1868 to 1878, but it failed to win independence. But a second independence war from 1895 to 98, that would follow, and as a result of increasingly strained relations between Spain and the United States, the Americans would enter the conflict in 1898, and in December of that year, with the Treaty of Paris, the U.S. would emerge as the victorious power in the Spanish-American War, which thereby would ensure the expulsion of Spain from Cuba and U.S. tutelage over Cuban affairs. It may have very well been possible that Cuba could have been a protectorate or potential state of the U.S., but that did not happen. On May 20th, 1902, after almost 5 years of U.S. military occupation, Cuba would launch into nationhood with arguably fewer problems than most Latin American nations had at the time. Prosperity would increase during the early years, and militarism seemed to be less than, again, what you had seen with many of the caudillos that were common in Latin and South America. Social tensions were not necessarily all that high, but corruption, violence, and political irresponsibility would grow. And so, invoking the 1901 Platt Amendment, the United States would intervene militarily in Cuba multiple times. 1906, 1917, 1921, Cuba was always something that the U.S. was prepared to intervene in, and U.S. economic involvement would weaken the growth of Cuba as a nation and made the island largely dependent on its northern neighbor. After this, fast forwarding of course, a series of US-backed military rulers and brutal dictators would follow over the course of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s until the government would eventually be overthrown by one Fidel Castro, which you may be familiar with. And yes, I know I am skipping through a lot of things here, I understand that, but we had to provide the setup for Cuba and show its relations with the United States, which, coincidentally enough, at this time just got a lot worse. And that is how it was going to be for the next 60-something years, all the way through today. You see, my friends, as the Castro regime would expropriate US properties and investments, arrest US citizens, and began to convert Cuba into a one-party communist system during the Cold War, relations between the US and Cuba naturally deteriorated rapidly. The United States would impose an embargo on Cuba on October 19, 1960, and would break all diplomatic relations on January 3, 1961. This was then followed a year later by the Cuban Missile Crisis, which arguably could have kicked off World War III, but that didn't happen. Following the imposition of US naval blockade, the nuclear weapons by the Soviets were withdrawn and the missile bases dismantled, with a US-Soviet agreement assuring Cuba's protection from military attack by the United States. Essentially, if the US tried to do anything overt in Cuba, the Soviets were going to get involved. And that is not something anyone wanted over the course of the 1960s. But this, my friends, is crucial for context, as it leads to everything that we're talking about here today, because the reality is that Cuba has always been heavily dependent on support from outside forces in one way, shape, or form or another. Whether this was Spanish patronage, American tutelage, Soviet subsidies, or Venezuelan oil, this has always been the case for Cuba. It has never been able to stand on its own. In this particular case, where we are here in its history, Cuba's alliance with the Soviets would provide a protective umbrella that would propel Castro onto the international scene. Cuba would time and time again support anti-US guerrilla and terrorist groups in Latin America and other countries of the developing world. They would launch military intervention in Africa, and unrestricted Soviet weapon deliveries to Cuba would make Castro an important international contender who could do, we're not going to say necessarily anything that he wanted, but he was involved in a lot more than arguably he had any right to be. But that's what happens when you are backed heavily by one of the major powers of the world. You see, Cuba, my friends, was the communist doorstop that could put the enemies of the United States easily within striking distance of it. And for decades, this relationship meant that the Soviet Union would do quite literally anything and everything in its power to prop up the state and ensure its survival, regardless of the problems and inefficiencies. It was, if anything, like how the US would prop up southern Vietnam over the course of the Vietnam War, which genuinely had no right to exist. It absolutely did not. But this went on a lot longer. And to that end, the sugar that we spoke about here before would basically keep the entire country on life support. Not because, sugar was super economically valuable and a miracle product. No, it is because the Soviet Union would subsidize the terribly run Cuban state by overpaying for its sugar for decades. See, due to the historical dependence on sugar, the Cuban economy was tied to external markets and price fluctuations, much in the same way that other states were tied to different resources, like Bolivia was to tin, Saudi Arabia was to oil, and still is to oil, Argentina was tied to beef, etc. It's really never a safe thing to have the majority of one's economy dependent on one product, especially if that is a product for export in which things could rapidly change. Moreover, the United States remained the major source of capital and technology that were needed to actually invest in and operate the sugar industry in general. So after the Cuban Revolution of 1959 and Fidel Castro's government tried to end monoproduction of sugar and shift the Cuban economy towards self-reliance through industrialization and economic diversification, it sounds great, but the industrialization effort largely failed. And not only did it fail, but the sugar production that had kept the economy going in the first place rapidly collapsed, which means that Cuba was forced to return to sugar production, which even then didn't really get much better. You see, Cuba's sugar production would suffer greatly at the beginning of industrialization in 1962. The communist state mandated job restructuring by the government would create a severe labor shortage at harvesting time, as state-run economies typically suck at managing said economies. That is seen time and time again. Along with this labor shortage, it didn't really help that the United States embargo against Cuba would restrict imports to the country, including replacement parts for the machinery in the sugar grinding mills that the whole thing primarily came from the United States in the first place. Like, again, I know when I talk about these things, I try to remain as neutral as possible. I do. Sometimes some bias slips in there, and I really do try and avoid this, but holy crap, I need to stress just how incredibly stupid this whole thing was, because it genuinely makes me wonder what Castro was thinking would happen with the economy when he went hard against the very thing that made everything about that economy possible in the first place. Like, it's that stupid and bad. Like, imagine if you had a company like Amazon or something that just suddenly said, you know what? No, we're not doing e-commerce anymore. We're not going to use the internet. That's how stupid of a business decision this is. Either way, Cuba was floundering, and it needed a new partner to replace the United States fast. And that replacement came in the form of their ideological ally, the Communist Soviet Union. But the big problem with this switch was that it meant trading with an entity that was literally halfway across the globe versus 90 miles away from Florida in the United States. That made transport and other costs of goods extremely high and inefficient. To give you an idea of what it is that I'm talking about here, in 1963, Cuba's trade balance was 3 times worse than it had been in 1962. Of Cuba's $700 million in imports, more than half of that included industrial parts, raw materials, and petroleum products, all of which were goods that you couldn't just get in Cuba. You had to import them. Cuba could also then not afford to finance new industries without taking on considerable debt, especially for industries that other countries were already doing much better and much more efficiently with non-state planned economies. They could not compete. As a result, Cuba was largely forced to return to the primary production of sugar, and they then depended on the Soviet Union as the overwhelming majority of their market. Instead of diversifying its economy, Cuba would push sugar profits into social programs for its population, providing healthcare, education, etc., things that, with time, would greatly earn the favor of the Cuban people, but it would not develop the state. Now, when I talk about this here, my friends, for a while, this was not necessarily going to be a problem. The state would carry on as long as there were no major shakeups in the world. And this is why you sometimes see high school and college students that argue about how amazing Cuba was because of its free healthcare, college, massive social support system, etc. On paper, everything looks pretty decent, but it comes at a massive cost, both humanitarian-wise and just in general economically, that most people do not understand. You see, the cost of sugar production was much higher in the Soviet Union than it was in Cuba. After all, sugar plantations don't exactly function very well in the middle of Siberia, and the growing Soviet consumption of sugar meant that they did in fact need additional sources of it. In contrast to this, Cuba was a low-cost producer of sugar and in need of the products that the Soviet Union could produce cheaply, including oil and machinery. On paper, it was a win-win, but the balance of value between these goods were leagues apart. Raw sugar versus oil and complex machinery? Yeah, there's no question as to what side was getting the better end of the deal. But for the sake of ideology, that wasn't really all that much important. Either way, Cuba and the Soviet Union would sign a long-term trade agreement in January of 1964 that allowed for the export of 24 million tons of sugar at a fixed price of 6.11 cents per pound from 1965 to 1970, which doesn't seem all that bad, but due to the decreasing sugar prices after 1963, the Soviet Union ended up paying almost twice the world price of sugar in order to subsidize Cuba and keep it afloat. Like they could have gotten stuff for 3 to 4 cents per pound, and instead they were paying over 6. Additionally, remember how it was supposed to be 24 million tons? Well, the first stage of that was to get to 10 million tons of production, but Cuba failed to increase its sugar production levels to that promised level of 10 million tons by 1970, which resulted in the Soviet Union further subsidizing Cuban sugar by more than $1.1 billion during this time. Now, the thing about this is that Cuba was not paid in currency per se, but rather in Soviet goods on a barter basis, which cost up to 50% more than similar goods from non-Soviet countries. Along with this, Cuba was also responsible for repaying loans to the Soviet Union, maintaining Soviet advisors, and military aid. And by 1974, Cuba's debt to the Soviet Union was something along the lines of $5 billion. And like, guys, when I talk about this, I'm telling you this right now, the economy of Cuba and the way that it interacted with the Soviet Union, and in general, a lot of the stuff for the Eastern Bloc made absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's pure ideology that just tries to force through economic realities that are not really compatible. Like, Soviet subsidies would average $4.3 billion a year for the period of 1986 to 1990. And this would constitute a whopping 21.2% of the entire Cuban gross national product. The Soviet Union would sell oil to Cuba at below market prices and would allow Cuba to then re-export this commodity to the world market, which would generate hard currency, which was worth more than 40% of the country's total revenues. Like, twice the share that was generated by the export of sugar, which was Cuba's primary crop and the principal commodity. So, like, straight up, the way that Cuba was getting the majority of its currency that was needed to actually buy other goods was by getting cheap fuel and then reselling said fuel. It wasn't even producing it. It was basically a merchant that was being subsidized by the Soviets. In 1987, the Soviet Union was paying Cuba an equivalent of 41.9 cents per pound for imported sugar, which was more than 6 times the average world market price of sugar, which was something like 6.7 cents per pound. That is insanely bad, yes, I know, but it's okay. It's okay. As long as nothing absolutely horrible happens to the Soviet Union, everything would be fine. Absolutely fine. Totally nothing's gonna. Oh, wait, no, hold on. What's that? Oh, yeah, there's a reason why the USSR is no longer on any maps. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, the suspension of economic relations with the former Soviet bloc would plunge Cuba into a crisis that threatened to undo 35 years of social gains and economic achievements, or what had been achievements on paper. The country would lose its primary supplier of imported food, machinery, and other goods, and was increasingly unable to purchase these goods from other sources as it lacked markets to export the goods that it produced at prices that were actually competitive. Then, to make matters worse, US Congress would go and tighten the embargo against Cuba with the Torricelli and the Helms-Burton Acts, which extended trade prohibitions and penalties to foreign companies and foreign subsidiaries of US companies, though the Helms-Burton Act would not really happen until, 1996? So when people try to say, oh, the US did this to Cuba, no, it absolutely did not. It did not cause the problems for Cuba, as many people say. It just definitely didn't help and made a problem that was already really bad worse. The gross national product would contract by as much as 50% between 1989 and 1993. Exports would fall by 79% and imports by 75%, with nothing being able to be done, produced, or bought. The budget deficit of the state would triple. The standard of living of the average member of the population would crash. It was awful. But you know what? Funnily enough, if you were going to go and describe an event like this, you'd probably have a very descriptive way of describing something so horrible, right? Like, you have the Great Depression in the case of the United States, or the Great Recession as what we would then see over the course of 2008 and going into the early 2010s. The Cubans, though, no, they, like North Korea, have a more interesting naming sense, as the Cuban government would declare this time of crisis to be a special period in time of peace, which is a name. And from there, they would implement rationing schedules that originally were designed to be nothing more than a contingency for during wartime. A change in the direction of economic policy was the only way to really confront the crisis, and reforms were gradually made with the goal of inserting the Cuban economy into international markets and stimulating domestic production, without, if you will, unsettling the social structure of the government and political system. But that wasn't really going to work out. Shortages would lead to strict rationing of energy and food production during the special period. Bread allocations would decrease to 80 grams per person per day. Gas sales to individuals were suspended altogether, and other utility services were limited to a few hours a day, with blackouts lasting up to 20 hours at a time per day. The government would promote bicycling as a means of transportation and ox-based agriculture as fossil fuel-free alternatives. In early 1993, nearly half of Havana's 1,200 buses were immobile. They were idle for lack of parts or fuel, and local taxi services disappeared entirely. By 1994, nearly 700,000 bicycles were distributed across the island by the government in order to allow the people to move a little. The disappearance of more than 300 medicines from local pharmacies, altogether with food shortages, would threaten the health and nutrition of all sectors of the population. An estimated 800,000 Cubans with asthma were going without necessary medications. Cubans would lose on average around 12 pounds by 1993, and optic neuropathy, or damage to optic nerves in the eye that leads to vision loss, would reach epidemic levels, with more than 50,000 Cubans suffering from it due to deficiency of vitamin B complex. And so now, of course, my friends, this is horrible. This is downright awful. And many would then rightfully wonder, how the hell does something like this get this bad this fast? And the answer is, well, it was never good in the first place. Cuba was effectively living off of borrowed time because of credit from the Soviet Union, which was subsidizing it. The Cuban state never should have been able to get to this point in the first place. You see, while the massive Soviet subsidies did enable Cuba's enormous state budget, that didn't lead to a more advanced or sustainable Cuban economy. Described by economists as a relatively highly developed Latin American export economy in 1959 and in the early 1960s, Cuba's fundamental economic structure didn't really change a lot between then and the 1990s. Tobacco products, such as cigars and cigarettes, were the only manufactured products among Cuba's leading exports, which doesn't necessarily seem all that bad, but you need to understand that you don't need an industrialized economy to produce tobacco products. Even a pre-industrial process is able to produce these. The Cuban economy remained inefficient and overspecialized in a few highly subsidized commodities that were provided by the Eastern Bloc countries. Subsidized sugar was the only thing that kept the economy afloat, and that is because it was being bought at way above market price by the Soviets, whether doubly as it was initially or 6 times the price as it was towards the end. With that gone, everything went to hell in a handbasket extremely quickly. So it was then, my friends, that the disruption and dislocation caused by the special period would penetrate deep into Cuban society. During this time, more than 1,000 people would go and protest the sinking of a tugboat of would-be immigrants in Havana Harbor, and 35,000 raft people, called balseros, would attempt the dangerous 90-mile journey to Miami on makeshift boats rather than endure conditions on the island. Many Cubans would experience the special period not only as a material crisis, but something that was also a crisis of their own internal politics, ideology, values, expectations, and faith that the state could continue forward on a path of progress and development with its communist ideals. For most people, seeing what was going on broke them of that faith. Thousands of Cubans would protest in Havana on the 5th of August 1994, with them chanting "Libertad" or freedom. The protest, in which some of the protesters would throw rocks at police, were then dispersed by police forces after only a few hours. And this, crazily enough, is arguably the closest that the Cuban opposition would ever come to asserting itself decisively in the one-party state, which we're going to be touching upon here later because that's a crucial detail that one needs to understand. But either way, so it was then, my friends, that the government of Cuba had no real choice but to make some reforms to try and generate hard currency and rejoin international trade networks. To that end, the state would amend the constitution to allow new forms of private and corporate property, regulate foreign investment, turn state companies into for-profit enterprises, and even, crazily enough, decriminalize the circulation of the US dollar, which that was a crime. International tourism was identified as a promising strategy, and state companies would remodel old hotels, worked with international partners to build new ones, and revamp small airports near beach areas to try and accommodate seasonal flight traffic from countries like Germany and Canada. But even with these and other limited reforms, the Cuban state was never really fixing itself in any meaningful way, and the special period, technically speaking, never really came to an end, which might sound confusing to some people because you would think, okay, well, if the special period never ended and things were that bad, why did Cuba not just collapse outright in the late 90s going into the early 2000s? How did it last so long? And the answer to that, my friends, is Venezuela. In the early 2000s, Castro and Chavez, the respective leaders of both countries, would strike a barter deal that would pull Cuba from the depths of its economic crisis with generous amounts of petroleum. Venezuela would start sending Cuba around 100,000 barrels of oil a day, and in exchange, Cuban doctors would go and set up clinics for the poor, which was Chavez's political base, in Venezuela's most downtrodden neighborhoods, with thousands of Venezuelans then able to travel free of charge to Havana for medical treatment of just about every ailment that you could imagine, including cancer, which Chavez himself would eventually have to do. It really seemed to be an amazing deal, and it was. With oil flowing in from Venezuela, Cuba was able to pay off long-standing debts and revamp the island's faded tourism industry. The workers for oil deal would generate far more income than rum, cigars, or anything else that Cuba was able to produce. The island's citizens themselves became the main export of the state. Cuban workers could then return from postings in oil-rich Venezuela with hard-to-find imported goods like TVs and other gear that Cuba didn't make and they weren't able to buy elsewhere. It was genuinely an amazing deal from them, and both countries knew it. Chavez would take to proclaiming that Cuba and Venezuela were in fact not two countries at all, but a single one called La Gran Patria, or the Big Homeland. He frequently would go on over to Havana for strategy sessions and to just play baseball at night with Castro. There are so many pictures of exactly that. You need to understand this here, my friends. When I'm talking about this, these two countries were intertwined. They were connected at the hip and mutually dependent on one another. When I say that, this is not like Cuba's former relationship with the Soviet Union of subsidies, which was maintained only because of the ideological goals and Cuba's close proximity to the United States. No, this is something that between the two states, this was true codependence. With the cheap Venezuelan oil flooding Cuba, the mostly command-style economy of the state was, for a time, safe, with the deal accounting for some 40% of Cuba's entire GDP in some shape or form. For its part, Venezuela was able to maintain high rates of social services led by skilled foreign doctors from Cuba. It was something that really worked for them. And from that, things sort of returned back to normal, but barely so. To be honest, the politicians of both countries would tout this as a massive success, which, yes, it was a success, but as we've covered here before, it was truly nothing more than life support for the nations, which could easily at any point be cut. Am I foreshadowing this hard enough for you yet? Yes, my friends, change was going to come. In some way, somehow, whether either government liked it or not. And hint, hint, neither one did. When Raul Castro would formally take over from Fidel in 2008, he would inherit a system that was, in his own words, unsustainable. He knew that in the 21st century, the command-style economy simply was unviable, but his vision for reform was not to abandon socialism, but instead to make it more efficient. To do this, the plan that he had was to reduce the state's immense burden as the nation's largest employer. The state was responsible for anything and everything, from paying salaries to providing lunch for millions of workers, many who worked in redundant or non-productive roles that didn't actually help or contribute to an economy. It was just a job that one could get paid for, like a position in an office where you don't actually do any work, but you still collect a paycheck. The 2001 lineamientos, or guidelines of the Communist Party, would then lay out a roadmap to do several things. First, lay off state workers, with the initial goal being to eliminate 1.8 million state jobs over several years. 2, to expand the private sector, with the government then legalizing over 200 different categories of cuentapropistas, or self-employed workers, such as restaurant owners called paladeres, bed and breakfast operators, the casas particulares, and taxi drivers, just to give you an idea of what it is that we're talking about. And so you understand just how important that part is, a taxi driver, in many cases, could make in one day what an engineer working for the Cuban state made over the course of a month. Yes, It was that broken. And finally, then, the third step were legal reforms, with the 2019 Constitution finally recognizing private property and allowing for the creation of small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, which are usually the backbone for any healthy economy. Which, when I'm talking about this here, my friends, it sounds pretty good. It does. It really does. But unfortunately for Cuba, these reforms would fail to have the impact that was hoped. These changes were simply far too little, far too late, and were actively being sabotaged by the state bureaucracy. Local Communist Party committees and government officials who were ideologically opposed to private wealth would oftentimes create obstacles, denying people licenses, imposing arbitrary fines, or simply making it impossible for private businesses to operate in the first place. Then, if you managed to somehow get your private business up and running, like in the case of a restaurant, you were still probably screwed because the owner could legally run a business, but they had no legal way to acquire food at wholesale prices. They were forced to buy ingredients at the same retail price as any regular customer, which made their business unviable except in the case of tourism. But for any regular Cuban, there was literally no reason to go to a restaurant. Like, it wasn't something that was viable. And on top of all that, private businesses had no access to bank credit or investment to try and expand. And there was a constant fear of success itself. If a business became too successful and then tried to expand, the government could crack down at any point or just outright confiscate it. This prevented the kind of investment that was needed for growth. And as a result, the private sector that grew was extremely small, extremely fragile, and entirely dependent on state-run markets for its inputs. It just wasn't an efficient or good thing at all. But it's about to get worse. Because while Cuba's economy was already stagnating from 2018 to 2020, COVID as well as the Trump administration's policies would crank up the pressure on it even more. First up, tourism was outright crushed. The 2019 ban on cruise ships was a body blow before COVID put the whole thing in a stranglehold. Cruises were things that brought in day trippers who would spend money in concentrated areas. More significantly, the administration would restrict individual people-to-people travel, which had been a major loophole allowing Americans to visit. This slashed tourist arrivals from the US, which had been a growing market. The more reliable visits then from Canada, Europe, and other places, well, that would basically cease after the start of the pandemic, which would destroy the burgeoning industry. Besides that, another key source of cash that Cubans would get is from remittances. But Western Union was forced to shut down its operations in Cuba in 2020. This severed the primary legal channel for Cuban Americans to send money home. And while informal channels did exist, they were far riskier and more expensive, cutting off a critical source of income that directly sustained millions of families and acted as a small-scale stimulus for the private economy. And then, on top of all of that, the activation of Title III of Helms-Burton Act was perhaps the most damaging long-term measure. This would allow Cuban Americans to sue international companies, including European and Canadian ones, that were trafficking in property that had been nationalized after the revolution. This created a massive chilling effect on business. International banks, fearing massive fines and loss of access to the US financial system, began to de-risk, refusing to process any transactions that were related to Cuba. This made it nearly impossible for Cuba to conduct international trade, even for humanitarian goods like food and medicine. It all ceased, or at least was slowing down, and then the pandemic happened. By 2020, Cuba was entering full meltdown territory, with its economy contracting by a whopping 10% that year. Of course, no singular issue would cause this, as a variety of factors would occur, including the pandemic and Trump policies that I mentioned just now, but also there was less subsidized fuel that was coming from Cuba's ally Venezuela, which had financially crashed at this point as well, as I've covered multiple times here before. Also, reforms that were attempted domestically proved to be utter disasters. See, the Cuban government would blame the crisis on the US trade embargo, as well as the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, but they neglected to mention their own awful decisions, such as the Tarea Ordenamiento issue, which, to explain that, this, my friends, was the most significant domestic policy event of the crisis. The government's stated goal was to eliminate the distortions of the dual currency system that they had, but the execution of this was a disaster of historic proportions. To understand the context of what it is that I'm talking about, because I know there will be some confusion as people have never heard of this here before, for decades, the official rate of currency exchange had been 1 CUC, which is the Cuban exchange peso that only existed to be pegged to the dollar for Cubans to use since dollars had been illegal for so long. But anyway, that was equal to $1, which was equal to 24 CUP, or normal Cuban pesos. That was the pegged rate. On the black market, however, $1 was worth a lot more. The ordenamiento would go and eliminate the CUC, and it set a singular official exchange rate of 24 CUP to the dollar. Then it forced all state-owned enterprises to revalue their assets and restate their finances at this new rate, which, for anyone who's curious then, because again, the dollar was massively worth more on the black market, that instantly created these massive paper profits on the accounting books, which the government then used to justify a massive wage increase for state workers. The problem, though, was that the new exchange rate was a complete fabrication. The true value of the CUP was way lower. And as soon as the policy was implemented, the black market rate for the dollar would explode, eventually reaching over 300 Cuban pesos to the dollar, not 24. The wage increases given out to state workers were virtually wiped out overnight by the reality of inflation. Prices in state stores, which had been converted from CUC to CUP at the official 24-to-1 rate, were suddenly astronomically high for a population whose salaries were now worthless. This created a massive gap between the official economy and the reality of the street, where everything was priced in dollars or at the black market rate. Overall, my friends, this entire thing was a massive wealth confiscation event at its finest, or I should say worst. The savings of ordinary Cubans held in CUP were rendered almost worthless overnight. The middle class of professionals, the doctors, engineers, and teachers, would see their life savings evaporate like that. This singular event destroyed what little social trust people had in the government's economic competence, and this was one of the primary driving factors of the July 11th, 2021 protests, which the government responded to with brutal efficiency, cracking down on them and arresting over 1,300 people. Since then, my friends, since 2021, the crisis has only deepened, something that went from an acute shock to a chronic systemic failure. The government has at this point largely abandoned any pretense of a recovery plan and is now more focused on managing the decline of the country. Perhaps the most visible and obvious sign of the crisis, is the apagones, or the blackouts. When I'm talking about this, they're not just due to the aging infrastructure, with many of the varying different power production facilities being 50 or 60 years old. They are a direct result of Cuba's inability to pay for even fuel and spare parts. In 2023 to 2024, blackouts of 12 to 18 hours a day were the norm, especially outside of Havana, which in turn had a cascading effect. Remember, no electricity means no production in factories, no internet for new private businesses, no refrigeration for food, which already there was very little food, so when the little food you had was spoiling very quickly, it meant even less food. Effectively, economic paralysis in the modern day and age was the new reality. This would make daily life difficult, if not impossible. Food spoils, water pumps stop working, heat becomes unbearable. From here, the combination of the energy crisis and the lack of inputs would destroy domestic agriculture. Farmers would have no diesel for tractors or irrigation pumps, instead going back to animal-based agriculture if they could even afford that. Though, of course, production became far more limited. The state had no dollars to import fertilizer, pesticides, or even basic foodstuffs to supplement the meager local harvests. And remember, most food had to be imported to the island despite 60 years of the government attempting self-sufficiency. The Libreta de Raciones, the ration book, which used to guarantee a basic basket of goods, would now provide almost nothing and often arrive late. Cubans would spend an estimated 70 to 80% of their income just to try and find food on the black market. All those promises for decades of free, high-quality healthcare, high-quality and free education, all of these things for their social services would end up hollow when there was no food to buy in the first place, and the highly educated wages would not pay for it anyway, even if it was there. To put that into perspective, a doctor earning the equivalent of $25 a month could earn over $10,000 a month in Spain or Latin America. As a result, over 1 million Cubans, over 10% of the population, a disproportionate number of them being the young and educated, the cream of the crop of Cuban society, would flee since 2021. This would leave hospitals understaffed, schools without teachers, factories without workers. Even if they do have workers, pharmacies are oftentimes just empty, and hospitals lack basic antibiotics, anesthetics, or even sutures. Patients are oftentimes required to bring their own sheets, soap, and food for their stay in the hospital. It is overall terrible, but the state can't really do anything to stop it, and instead of reform, they only try to limit or control the collapse. As an example of this, think of the stat that I gave here just a second ago of over 1 million Cubans fleeing the country. By tacitly allowing its citizens to leave, the government ends up removing the most dissatisfied and desperate elements of the population, which reduces the risk of another large-scale uprising. Even if it does not help productivity, it reduces internal threats. The crackdown following the July 11th and other protests in 2024 would later send a clear message to those that remained that dissent was not going to be tolerated. To that end, President Diaz-Canel would later say in a public address reiterating this that, quote, such actions will be prosecuted with the rigor that the revolutionary laws contemplate, end quote. Yeah, but now that, my friends, that finally brings us to where it is that we are here today, in 2026. Now that former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is in U.S. captivity and a more compliant government is in charge in Caracas, attention has very quickly been drawn to Cuba. On January 3rd, 2026, within hours of the successful execution of Operation Midnight Hammer, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who himself is a son of Cuban immigrants who came to the U.S. pursuing the American dream, would go on to say, quote, if I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned at least a little bit, end quote. Just one day after this, Rubio would reiterate the warning to Cuba, saying, quote, they're in a lot of trouble. And also, I'm not going to talk to you about what our future steps are going to be and our policies are going to be right now in this regard, but I don't think it's any mystery that we are not big fans of the Cuban regime, who, by the way, are the ones that were propping up Maduro, end quote. And yes, this is true, they absolutely were. Rubio would go on to note how Maduro's personal bodyguards were Cubans. Like, his own bodyguard force were not his own people because Maduro could not trust them to not turn on him. He had to actually employ Cuban bodyguards. Bodyguards which subsequently ended up being returned back to Cuba in little boxes. Yeah. As it is, my friends, incidentally, Rubio has been a long-time Cuban hawk, if you will, and has for years pursued regime change in Havana. And with what is going on, it seems now that his dream is closer to reality than ever. Because when I am talking about this, Trump's ultimate goal here seems to be to reassert America's position on the world stage. But more importantly, it is to secure its position in the Western Hemisphere, with the whole thing effectively being America's exclusive economic zone. This is essentially his modern version of the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, which has been recast as the Donroe Doctrine by Trump, but arguably this is something that could not be fulfilled by the presence of hostile forces, such as Venezuela and Cuba, providing spaces to Washington's adversaries, such as China and Russia. Venezuela is not exactly a problem anymore, which means that all that is really left is Cuba. According to some news sources, such as the Wall Street Journal, the Trump administration is seeking regime change in Havana by the end of this year. While yes, the US has pursued regime change in Cuba for over 7 decades now, with every attempt having been a failure, which on that note, I saw some memes talking about this that were like, Operation It Can't Go Wrong a second time. I can only imagine how fire the memes are going to be if it actually takes place. But this is perhaps a golden opportunity for such an endeavor for several reasons. From everything that I have described, if you have watched the course of this video, you would understand that in the year 2026, Cuba simply does not have many friends. Even less now with Maduro having been captured. And with Russia still occupied with Ukraine, China is arguably the only country that could theoretically come to Cuba's rescue. And yes, both countries, both China and Russia, have pledged support, but Russia merely sent their interior minister, Vladimir Kolotsev, for a visit this past week to meet with the Cuban president and military, while Beijing would commit $80 million in aid. It is something, yes, but after the Venezuela operation, it is doubtful if either Beijing or Moscow could even hope to try to challenge US power in the Western Hemisphere. Such a thing would likely be impossible. So, with that being considered, Cuba is on its own for the most part, now more than ever in its history, with the exception of during the special period. The loss of Venezuela is going to hurt it dearly, as it was getting subsidized oil from Caracas for the last 26 years. After Maduro's capture, Trump would warn that no more oil was going to reach Cuba, saying, and I quote on his Truth Social platform on January 11th, "There will be no more oil or money going to Cuba. Zero. I strongly suggest they make a deal before it is too late." Cuba lived for many years on large amounts of oil and money from Venezuela. End quote. Which, yeah, that is true, and it just reiterates the points that I've made over the course of this video. As for what is actually going to happen, well, according to a Wall Street Journal report, the Trump administration is currently focusing on identifying someone inside of the Cuban government who would be willing to cut a deal with the US. Whether that will pan out, though, is uncertain. The pressure is going to keep increasing either way, both externally and internally. Cuba, being an island, means that the US could very easily enforce a full economic blockade of the country. Washington already has a significant naval deployment in the Caribbean around the Cuban islands, so it does not need to redeploy forces from elsewhere. US intelligence assessments have painted a grim picture of the island's economy, if, I haven't done so already over the course of this, which is plagued by chronic shortages of basic goods, medicines, and frequent blackouts, which shut the entire thing down. At the rate that things are going, within a month, it is estimated that the island nation could be completely out of oil, and this would send the sinking economy crashing into the sea. But again, the question remains, will the regime actually change on its own, or will something more drastic, like in the case of Venezuela's Maduro, need to be done? After all, a regime change in Cuba will not only fulfill the long-standing US dream from the Cold War era, it would also ensure Trump's name goes down in history as the president who finally ended the hostile communist regime right on the US's doorstep that aids its foes. It would be a huge deal. If successful, it would be arguably one of the greatest geopolitical successes in all of American history. But the key word there is if. Nothing is certain, of course. The Trump administration also realizes, despite its strong language, from Donnie, that it must proceed with caution, as history shows that Cuba is a very tough nut to crack. The chances of Cuba's government falling on its own are low, to put it mildly. And so, in the end here, my friends, I need to really explain that part because there's going to be a lot of people in the comments that are going to be predicting just doom and gloom. People love to focus on that specific part, but fail to understand the details that make such a collapse likely or even possible in the first place. In Cuba's case, it's hard to see something viable like you could with Venezuela's opposition parties. Opponents of the regime in Cuba are straight up not allowed to participate in the elections. It is a true one-party state, with the military and civilian leadership roles all being taken or given to ardent supporters. And with billions of dollars stolen over the years through nationalization and state-owned enterprises, there are various economic incentives for the current leadership to not give up power. They would lose everything, so why change? On top of that, it's not like they're not capable of stopping change. Repression of the population of Cuba is highly successful and even easy at this point. The few major protest movements that have taken place have all been ruthlessly crushed. There is no real opposition for said movements to support anyway. There is no leader to rally behind. There is no party to vote in. Nothing. Any attempt to make an opposition is watched and crushed by Cuba's massive intelligence network and secret police. So there's no real hint of an armed guerrilla movement or insurgency in the country that could overthrow things internally rapidly anyway. There is, simply right now, no real alternative or even the possibility of one developing quickly. So, as it is, my friends, Cuba may be a basket case, but even if it's not strong, it is more resilient than people give it credit for. The regime has survived numerous pressure campaigns before, including decades of sanctions, covert operations, economic instability, as we've covered all here before. And at the other end of the spectrum, it has even survived US efforts to negotiate under President Obama, which there was a time where that did happen. Small changes have taken place, yes, but those often mean little and are very easily reversed. The current situation is bad. Really, really bad. But not necessarily something that is worse than the start of the special period after the fall of the Soviet Union. It is very possible that what will take place will just be the 2.0 version of that until perhaps maybe years down the line, another power steps in to act as Cuba's life support again. As such, even if the best scenario for Trump is that the regime collapses under the pressure of renewed economic and oil blockades, the chances of that actually happening are iffy to say the least. So if it doesn't work, the Trump administration is preparing to take the next step, just like it did with Venezuela, as the Cuban regime is friendless, it's at its weakest in many decades, and is central to the success of the Dawn Road doctrine. Only time will tell whether or not that will actually pan out, but you can bet that whatever does happen, we will be here to tell you the story of how it took place in the first place. And with that, my friends, we're going to go ahead and end things here today. Hopefully it's not too late, but we'll see how this goes. I get a lot of comments on my videos that say that, yes, this video is already out of date, but we'll see. Thank you all for watching. Let me know in the comment section below what it is that you'd like to see next, and I will see you all here later, my friends. Best of luck, and please don't let the world burn down. Goodbye, everyone.